Okay, I think this is probably a good time to start. So welcome everybody, thank you for joining me. Today, I'm going to be talking about everything that we've managed to find out so far about DevOps Center. So my name's Matt, and I'm co-founder and chief product officer at Gearset, for those of you that haven't met me before. My background's in software development, and I've been building things for nearly about 15 years now. I originally started out in video games, and then I moved into developer productivity tools, and then into DevOps. I've been responsible for building some fairly big parts of Gearset early on. And since then, I've looked after marketing for a little bit. And then more recently, I've been heading up our product direction as a whole. The plan was to have Kevin here today as well, but unfortunately, he can't make it. And he does send his apologies. I'm afraid you're stuck with just me. So just to set some expectations up front for those of you who attended our recent webinar on this very topic, then you will have heard most of this before. So if you've already heard a lot of this stuff, then we haven't managed to find out a huge amount of new information, but we have made some minor updates. So the plan today is to talk through, like I say, everything that we've learned so far about DevOps Center. We've pulled this together from everywhere we could find around the web, but we've also tried to delve into some of the detail of how it potentially works to kind of infer some of what's going on in the product behind the scenes as well. I should say, feel free to leave questions as we go, and I'll try to address all of those at the end. So to fully understand why Salesforce are creating DevOps Center, it's probably first worth looking at how DevOps on the platform has evolved. So I think we'll probably all agree that Salesforce is the leading enterprise application platform as a service, but that wasn't always the case. As many of you know, Salesforce started out life as this category-defining CRM application, and Salesforce as a CRM has been successful for literally tons of reasons, but a really important one among them was its unparalleled customizability. So you didn't need to wait on your CRM provider to implement changes to suit that workflow that you were following. You could just mold the application to those unique processes yourself and then crack on with work. And obviously, as Salesforce grew in success, then so did the complexity and the degree of customization that customers are making. So the first major way that Salesforce started to enable teams of folks customizing the platform was via the metadata API. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but as you know, it offers a very rough way to externalize customizations that have been made, so to export and import them. And that was largely originally to facilitate the use of sandboxes. The metadata API then led to the initial wave of tools like Maven's Mate and the Eclipse IDE and the really basic wrappers around that API, like the Force.com migration tool, the Ant tool, if you've used that before. But hand in hand with that, then the platform broadened at the same time. And those two things together facilitated these more complex customizations and applications built entirely on top of Salesforce. And with that, you would then end up with larger teams doing more complex things. And with that came along tools like Gearset and Capado and AutoRabbit. And these emerged to help those teams manage the development lifecycle of those changes by using DevOps processes. And all of these vendors, as included, are allowing teams to adopt these industry recognized practices like source control and continuous integration. And Salesforce spotted that we were sort of all having to jump through similar hoops, I suppose, to get the metadata API to do what we really wanted it to do, often reinventing the wheel or kind of diverging from each other a little bit. So this is kind of the advent of Salesforce DX, which Salesforce introduced really to provide, I think the term they use is a unified set of primitives. And that's something that then the community and the DevOps vendors like Gearset have been building on top of. So when Salesforce announced Salesforce DX, one of the core principles was to get all customers to move away from the org as the source of truth and to adopt the source control system as the main way to collaborate. Now, Salesforce DX is a technical solution for a technical audience. So using Git and the Salesforce CLI, it has a pretty steep learning curve. I'm sure any of you who've tried it have probably discovered, particularly if you're not familiar with using command line tools on a day-to-day basis. So as a result, DX has proven really popular with hardcore developers and teams with a strong technical bent or devs coming from other platforms. But then I think it's also fair to say that adoption of DX hasn't been super widespread, as has been illustrated by, I guess, the advent of DevOps Center, primarily due to that learning curve. So if a team's built a process around the Salesforce CLI and Salesforce DX, it's really not uncommon to see this siloing situation start to crop up, where you have programmatic developers on a team using VS Code and the Salesforce CLI to work with Git, And then you have admins and declarative developers that are often left to rely on those developers to migrate their changes or to use an entirely different workflow altogether. And then this often means that a lot of those declarative changes aren't actually captured in the source control system, which to my mind subverts the DevOps process somewhat and kind of erodes that value in adopting those tools and practices in the first place. So let's say there's this spectrum from declarative developer through to the programmatic developer, and Salesforce DX targets that programmatic end, and DevOps Center takes over where DX leaves off. Getting declarative developers and admins a way to take part in source control is a really big thing compared to where we are today, where I'd say change sets is actually still sadly fairly prevalent. And I think change sets are still so popular because the majority of Salesforce customers start off without these complex DevOps challenges. Obviously, that's not true for enterprise customers that are adopting Salesforce. They tend to be able to foresee the coming complexity probably because they've experienced it before in other areas. But for many customers, it's something that kind of creeps up over time. So for many, life starts with change sets, which although is, I guess, very frustrating to use in my experience, it does get the job done to a certain degree. And it's built in, it's free, it's from the first party. So it's kind of a default choice to begin with. But the real big limitation, frustrations aside, is that it leads you down this dead end. So it encourages you to invest your time and energy in learning this tool and these processes, but they'll inevitably run out of road when the complexity of your org and your team grows. So I guess it really is an inevitability from what we've seen for most types of customers. And when that happens, you can't make an easy transition onto a new process. You have to essentially reset and learn a whole new way of working and a whole new tool set. So that's where DevOps Center comes in. It's the next phase in Salesforce's vision of having Git be the way to collaborate on the platform. It's a built-in way of adopting source control on day one, so that when complexity increases and you need to work with other industry standard tools, you've already got this history that you've built up in your source control system and an investment in using that and building your team's relationship with it, I guess. And this now aligns with the expectations of kind of more traditional engineering teams in general, and then also business decision makers when they're looking at adopting platforms like Salesforce. So we've heard why DevOps Center is useful and how it fits in alongside DX. Now let's take a look at what's going to be in there on day one and then where we think it's going to head. So as I've already said, the idea is that DevOps Center bridges the gap between programmatic and declarative developers. And the vision is that it's essentially a UI-driven companion to DX that will let programmatic and declarative developers both manage all of their changes through Git, delivering on that vision of externalizing the source of truth for your org. So to begin with, it covers the section that we've got highlighted in the diagram here. So taking the changes made in a sandbox and committing them to Git. But looking further out, it'll obviously go a bit further than that as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. Ultimately, though, the goal is to get more Salesforce teams adopting source-driven development workflows and DevOps practices, which then allows them to make changes more regularly, more reliably, and basically get more value from the platform. So looking at how DevOps Center actually works, we've pulled a bunch of these details from publicly available demos from things like TDX. So some of this will be familiar if you've already read up on those things. So firstly, DevOps Center is delivered as a managed package that you install into a DevHub org. Once you've installed it and it's up and running, you'll find that the workflow is built around these two concepts of projects and work items. So projects are a container for work items, and they have a one-to-one mapping with an associated Git repo. It's pretty likely, in fact, I think it's confirmed that DevOps Center is going to support all the usual Git providers that you'd expect, but GitHub's going to be the one that's available first at launch. So within these projects, you then have a series of work items which describe the various tasks or deliverables that your team's working on. And these are, often referred to as user stories. They'll be really familiar to users of Jira or Agile Accelerator or so. If you open up one of those work items, you'll see that they're fairly lightweight. So there's a subject and a description, and those are really the only user configurable parts. I do expect to see integration with all of the popular third-party tools here, like Jira and Agile Accelerator. I think they've been mentioned publicly so far. They've been publicly mentioned so far as targets for integration. So you can expect to see that. So when creating a work item in DevOps Center, you'll pick a sandbox to associate with it. And this is the dev environment that you'll be making changes in for that particular work item. So when you make those changes, they'll be associated and tracked with that work item. You'll be able to connect any number of sandboxes and scratch orgs to DevOps Center. And once you've attached them, you can then assign them to different work items basically arbitrarily. You can see in the screenshot here that there's a source field which references a dev sandbox, dev SV4. That's the sandbox that's associated with that work item. Then the other thing to notice here is there's also a destination, and that points at a Git branch. So I mentioned earlier that each project has this one-to-one mapping with a repo, where each work item within the project has a one-to-one mapping with a branch within the repo. So when you start work on a work item, DevOps Center then goes ahead and creates that branch in the background for you. Then if you click Launch Dev Environment in the top right there, that bounces you out to that associated sandbox, and you can start making changes. Once you've made some changes, you can associate them with your work item in I guess what's quite a kind of nice and convenient way. So DevOps Center uses this source tracking feature that you might have seen if you've used Scratch orgs, and it's also currently in beta and sandboxes as well. So you can click that Pull Changes button in the bottom left, and that'll populate your work item with all of the metadata items that you've touched in your dev sandbox that you've made changes to. Now, I think we first looked at this, just a bit of background, we first looked at source tracking when it originally got released way back when, attached to Scratch orgs, and we found that it didn't have that great coverage of the metadata API or things like that. So there were kind of a few too many shortcomings for it to be really useful. But these days, it looks like it's pretty great. So the metadata coverage report shows that it has pretty much parity with the metadata API as a whole. So it's pretty unlikely that you'll accidentally miss any changes that it doesn't detect. It looks pretty robust these days, and we're actually looking at incorporating it into a bunch of Gearset's workflows as well. So we're pretty confident that it's really solid. So once you've done that, you can then stage those changes to commit to the associated branch. And when you've done that, you can add a commit message, like a comment, hit submit changes, and then that will commit those changes to your branch. So behind the scenes, what's actually happening is it's running a Git checkout, a Git add, a Git commit, and a Git push to make sure that all those changes are committed to your branch and then synced back to GitHub without you having to issue any Git commands by hand, which is quite cool. And then if you mark the ticket as completed and move it to in review, then DevOps Center will automatically create a pull request between the work item branch and master in that project's repo. And that's actually everything that we expect to see in the initial release. Now, I guess one of the things to say here up front is that Gearset and DevOps Center do compete to a certain degree. We solve some parts of the same problem. And I want to make it very clear that I'm not trying to come across as a biased or cynical tools vendor, or that I'm criticizing the competition or anything like that here. So firstly, what I guess what I want to say is what I've seen of DevOps Center so far, I think it's really cool. I think it's fantastic. And I know that there's a team of really great people that are working on it, some of whom we know really, really well. But I still think it's worth talking about what's missing and what some of the challenges might be going forwards. So looking at what's missing, firstly, there's no deployment to orgs. So at the moment, everything in DevOps Center is built around pulling changes from orgs into Git repos. And that's obviously really helpful if you've already got a DevOps tool on your team. So if you've already got a CI server set up or a pipeline or something like that, because it means that DevOps Center can be really useful for your declarative developers and your admins. And then when they've pushed their changes into source control, you can kind of hand off to your existing DevOps tool and pull those changes from your source control system and run them through your release pipeline from there. But what it does mean then is that it's not an immediate drop-in replacement for something like change sets yet, because there's no built-in mechanism to push those changes back to an org. All of that said, I'm certain that we'll see this soon. So I think the plan is for deployments to be released in the pilot, which I think is due sometime early-ish next year, but not 100% certain. So obviously no deployments, that means there's no CI in there. So I think further down the line, I'd expect to see a more complete pipeline model with changes moving from, between your environments. So from QA to UAT and out to release and so on. I guess I wouldn't be surprised to see Salesforce demoing DevOps Center used in conjunction with something like Heroku Flow and Salesforce DX or something like that. But as things stand, if you want end-to-end DevOps, then you'll need to use an external tool. Then although you can choose which top-level items you want to commit to your Git branch, there's not a fine-grained control over what changes to commit. So if multiple changes have been made on the same item in a sandbox and you want to deploy a subset of those changes, then you're out of luck at the moment. And then lastly, alongside this comes, I guess, a lack of built-in comparison. So you can fetch changes and choose which kind of top-level items you want to include or exclude from your commit. but you can't review what's changed before committing it to your branch, which does run the risk of including things that you didn't necessarily intend to. And then obviously there are other things that DevOps Center isn't really expected to tackle, like data deployments, for instance. But these things here are some of the things that I think would make sense, but are currently absent. So in terms of what's coming, I've already touched on most of these, but just to clarify, firstly, we'll see deployments from branches to orgs, and I think that's due in the pilot next year. Then we'd expect to see lots of integrations with the sorts of tools that round out your DevOps process. So particularly with popular source control providers like GitLab and so on, and then ALM tools and CI tools as well. And then thirdly, I think we have a pretty strong hunch that at some point we'll see some sort of built-in CI functionality, and I would guess that it would be based around Heroku, mostly because back around the announcement of Salesforce DX, maybe 4 years ago now, a little bit more than that maybe, we had this brief glimpse of Heroku-powered CI for Salesforce. So it wouldn't be surprising if that's still something that's on the horizon. Okay, so now we've looked at the features. Let's look at what those features actually buy us. So firstly, the work item flow is nice because it keeps the work that you're doing really focused on a particular well-defined and scoped deliverable. And it provides a way to group the changes that you've made into a single concept. If you're using a Git workflow based on the feature branch model, then you're in really good hands. That's, from what I've seen, that's the best fit for DevOps Center so far, based on that enforcing of one repo per project and one branch per work item. It's just a very natural fit. DevOps Center is a really promising start and definitely goes a decent way to solving the problems that it sets out to address. So if part of your team is already working from source control and has a DevOps process in place, or part of your team is responsible for solving that side of the equation, then DevOps Center opens that process up to the wider team and kind of breaks down some of those silos. And it also lets declarative developers and admins take advantage of some of the key features of source control. So it's an easy way to share your changes with your colleagues via the source control provider, and introduce peer review into your development process too. So I guess what are the extra challenges? So firstly, DevOps Center isn't even out yet. So there are definitely going to be limitations to these early releases and pilot versions and so on. But beyond the short-term missing features, I think it's worth looking at a few areas that might make using source control, even when there's something built in like DevOps Center, still kind of challenging. So firstly, DevOps isn't just about tooling. And I guess if any of you've been looking into DevOps heavily, you've probably heard this from a bunch of different people. But I think you can have the best tooling in the world and still struggle adopting some of this stuff. I think the way we see it is that DevOps is the coming together of tools, processes, and people. So having a great tool can make the process and people side easier, but you still need all of these things working in concert. So a few examples. A core concept in DevOps Center is this work item. Getting the right level of granularity to those work items is really key to being successful. And that means that it's vital to have these well-defined, small, isolated tasks. But that's actually really hard to do. It's really tricky to break down large features or large deliverables into these small, isolated tasks without things overlapping. So that's a learning curve that most teams adopting a kind of more frequent release cadence based around a DevOps process is something that they'll have to learn. And then when you factor in many teams still have a single release window of once per sprint, it can be a month or more between releases to production. And then during that time period, you can end up with tricky cases like conflicts that can occur. And then this kind of happy path that DevOps Center caters to and presents, the one that's based around that feature branching model, starts to break down a little bit. And that kind of leads on to the next point of, it's kind of unclear how well DevOps Center is going to support branching strategies that are more complex than that feature branching model. So, I mean, I personally, and at Gearset, we think feature branching is a great way to work and we actively encourage it. So if you can use that model, then I absolutely think you should. It's the simplest model, and it means shipping features to production as and when they're ready rather than on a specific cadence. But there are lots of teams who don't use this branching model for lots of reasons. Firstly, there are levels of complexity where it can fall apart. It may just be a case of inertia in the process that your team is comfortable with and used to. So it's not really clear how DevOps Center will support more complex branching strategies like Git flow and things like that. And then, as I mentioned, a missing part of this puzzle is a really big missing part, to be honest, is deploying changes from source control to an org. And it's it's important for lots of reasons. So it's not just the point downstream in the deployment process where you come to actually deploy out to production or deploy out to those target orgs. The act of starting work in a sandbox usually involves first syncing changes from your feature branch back into that sandbox to make sure you've got a clean starting point to make your changes on top of. So it's really useful basically immediately in that development process. And it may sound like a pretty straightforward proposition, excuse me, to push changes from a branch to an org, because it's just the reverse of what DevOps Center is already doing, right? But as someone who's spent 5 years building tools on top of the metadata API to solve this exact problem, I don't think it's easy. Just a couple of examples of things that we've had to deal with in Gearset. We've had to batch requests to work around item limits and package size limits and think carefully about how things like profiles interact with that batching, because there are edge cases around retrieving things in profiles from the metadata API. We've had to decompose compound types to make them easier to deploy and merge. And again, that doesn't sound super tricky, but dealing with gigabytes of profiles in a way that's fast and efficient so you can deploy just a couple of new field permissions, it's actually a fairly non-trivial task. And then we've built around 50 problem analyzers that detect and automatically fix common causes of deployment failures, including things like API backwards compatibility issues, obsolete metadata, edge cases around process builder flows, metadata containing hard-coded usernames. This list goes on and on. And these are just a few of the issues that we've had to deal with, and the DevOps Center team, they'll have to deal with as well at some point. And then it looks like a requirement for DevOps Center to work cleanly is to have team members working in isolated sandboxes. So no more working in shared sandboxes. But that does beg a couple of questions. So firstly, how common is it for each team member to have their own isolated sandbox? And although it's recommended, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's rare, it's also not rare to have multiple people still working in the same sandbox. And then secondly, and perhaps more importantly, how do I go about spinning up a sandbox that's well configured and looks like my feature branch? Scratch orgs assist a bit here, but it's far from a solved problem. And then it comes back to that cleanly deploying changes to make my org look like my source control system challenge that we were talking about just a moment ago. So once you've got your own sandbox to work in and you're pretty happy and content, there's then that realization that you're never working on things in isolation, really, and you want to share those changes amongst colleagues on the team who are working in independent sandboxes. Obviously, you can do that through the source control system, but then backpropagating those changes from downstream environments can be quite a tricky problem that involves merging, and I'm sure you've guessed it already, but pushing those changes back out to orgs through deployments again. And then finally, metadata is definitely a significant part of the puzzle, but there's also the question of how does your sandbox get enough data to be useful for developing and testing? And to be clear, all of these are tractable problems and they can definitely be solved over time, but they'll still present some challenges for sure. And then the last thing to call out is, I think that with all DevOps tooling, there's a tension in terms of how much of the underlying complexity of Git, source control, branching, and CI should be exposed to the user. So with something like the Salesforce CLI, you can obviously see all of the detail of how everything works, and you can issue all of the commands manually to make all of this stuff, to orchestrate all of this stuff and make it all happen. But that's what creates the learning curve. There's a bunch of stuff you need to learn and know to be able to do that. But then there's a potential pitfall to doing things like binding branching so closely to work items and hiding the detail of branch manipulation. Now, I think I said before that it remains to be seen how far DevOps Center will take this concept, but while creating emerging branches by updating ticket statuses is this conceptually pleasing idea, in practice, hiding the detail of those branching operations runs the risk of leaving people with I suppose a diminished understanding of what's actually going on behind the scenes there. So it means that as and when things occasionally go wrong, then users won't necessarily have built that understanding of what's happening, so that they'll have very little knowledge of how to work around these problems. So hiding the complexity in this way can be helpful, but there's definitely a balance to be struck. And I guess we won't know if the balance is right here until we're all using DevOps Center in the wild. So just to summarize quickly, I think DX has solved part of the DevOps puzzle, but obviously it's not the solution for everybody. And that means at best there's siloing, and at worst you have teams that can't adopt source control or DevOps practices whatsoever. So DevOps Center is intended to address that problem specifically. And to begin with, it's going to be all about making changes in your org and then pushing them into a Git repo without having to familiarize yourself with Git or all of the tooling that it entails. Going forwards, then it's going to address some of the other integral problems to a Git-centric workflow, particularly around deployment, but there are still going to be some gaps. And then there are still some open questions about how robustly DevOps Center will be able to solve that problem. So those are the main things that I wanted to talk about around DevOps Center today. One last thing to mention, I said that tools only go so far, only part of the problem here, and that there's definitely a process problem too. We've seen a lot of pent-up demand for learning materials around DevOps concepts specifically tailored towards Salesforce teams. Obviously, there's a ton of information online about branching models and all of these DevOps concepts as they pertain to lots of different software stacks. But I think there are specific interesting cases around Salesforce teams that mean there's a little bit of a gap there. So to try to help, we've built something called DevOps Launchpad. It's a completely free learning resource, and we're trying to keep it vendor agnostic. So we're trying to provide a whole variety of learning materials about all things related to DevOps from Salesforce. There, at the moment, if you take a look at it, there are a small but growing number of courses, mostly focused around Git, but we're sourcing some completely independent content from around the ecosystem as we speak on lots more topics too. So there'll be a bunch more stuff appearing there in the very near future. Like I said, it's completely free, so feel free to sign up and run through some of the courses if you're interested in learning more about any of these topics. And then obviously, please send your feedback our way about how useful you found the content and what types of content you'd like to see. And obviously, if you'd like to contribute as well. Now, I think that's the end of the slides that I have, so I'm just going to switch over and see if there are any questions. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask? Either about DevOps Center or Gearset or DevOps on Salesforce in general. I'm seeing no questions yet, but hopefully if you have a click around in the Zoom UI, you can find a little Q&A box. Now I'm concerned that somehow I've not enabled questions. Here we go. Few rolling in. Good stuff. Thank you, folks. Thanks, Kenny, for the kind words. Julianne asked whether there'll be a recording available for replay afterwards. Yes, there will. I can add plenty of detail about what Gearset adds to the DevOps solution. So I guess where does Gearset fit into this equation? Gearset is essentially an end-to-end DevOps solution for Salesforce, and it's designed to be something that can take you on that journey of kind of DevOps maturity. I guess the problem that we were talking about with change sets, where it takes you so far and there's a dead end and then you have to switch to a different set of tooling. Gearset's intended to be, firstly, a drop-in replacement for change sets for people that are familiar with it. So it should be very straightforward to use and get up to speed with, but then there's no dead end. It can take you right from that running manual comparisons and deployments between orgs through pushing changes into your source control system in a similar way to the way that DevOps Center is doing it. But then it goes a lot further beyond that and lets you set up your own CI pipelines and promote changes through environments and a whole bunch of other stuff around that, including data deployments and backup as well. It's probably worth running several more webinars on that topic rather than going into much more detail than that right now. But if you'd like to find out more about Gearset specifically, feel free to ping me an email. I'm just Matt, M-A-T-T @gearset.com. And I'll follow up with you and we can arrange things like one-on-one demos that obviously not sales pitches. We're just going to show you how the tools work and answer your questions. I've got a question from Ravi. Is Gearset built on native? Is it built natively on the Salesforce platform? No, Gearset sits outside of the Salesforce platform. We build on top of the same infrastructure that Salesforce builds on top of, actually. So we're built on top of AWS and in a lot of the same data centers as Salesforce. But we found that having our own control over that infrastructure meant that it basically freed up a lot more processing power for us to do some of the more complex things that we do. And also it gave us a bit more control over the UI, so we could, I guess, build more tailored and specific workflows. Another question coming in. Do you see DX and DevOps Center as truly complementary, or is DX more targeted for package-based development, whereas DevOps Center might be more for org-based? That's a really good question. I do believe that they're going to be truly complementary. So at the moment, I don't think there's much publicly about package-based development via DevOps Center, but I do think it's something that's, you know, essentially on the distant roadmap somewhere. I don't have much internal visibility into this, but I actually ran a webinar like this recently that one of the team leads, Karen from Salesforce, came along to, and one of the points that she made later was they do intend to support that packaging workflow. I guess that doesn't answer the question of whether DX is more targeted towards a package-based development. And to be honest, as somebody who spends a lot of time in around the Salesforce ecosystem, I definitely see a lot more prevalence of, I guess, the package-oriented features in DX in kind of specific subsets of the audience. I've not made myself very clear there, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's fairly widespread adoption of the DX repo format, for instance, across lots and lots of different types of team. But as soon as you start moving towards more complex DX features using things like scratch orgs, then that tends to be closely tied to packaging and generally more common inside things like ISVs rather than SIs and in-house IT orgs. I hope that answers your question. Cornelia. Hi, Cornelia. Nice to speak to you again. How is the overall Salesforce CI/CD ecosystem responding to this? You seem to be open to working with it broadly, but what about others? That's a really good question. I suppose what I don't have as much visibility on is how companies like Capado and AutoRabbit and so on are responding to this. I imagine their approach is largely going to be similar to our own, which is to, I mean, I guess the thing we've always done when Salesforce release things like this is kind of embrace and build on top of them. So I think one of the ways that we're thinking about DevOps Center is that it's quite targeted on a specific subset of types of user. I think it's for teams of a certain level of experience and size that are getting started on their or that have a group of users who are getting started on their journey of using Git. And that means that it only really solves what I think is quite a small subset of the types of problem that Gearset solve. And that gives us a really good opportunity to kind of extend it and build around it and support people when they hit the limitations of that, but in a way that's complementary to it. So they're already familiar with this mode of working. They've hit the limits of what they can do with DevOps Center, and now they need some more sophisticated tooling. I think that that's where tools like Gearset and some of the other tools in the ecosystem can come in. And I imagine we'll all broadly approach it in the same way, but obviously I can't speak for other vendors. That's my guess. Yeah, just to confirm, there will be a recording. And yeah, if anybody does want a copy of the slides, I'm more than happy to send those over. So if you drop me a quick email at matt, M-A-T-T, gearset.com, then I can send that over there. VJ asks, how is Gearset good on the backsync process? I would actually say that Gearset helps in syncing changes back to earlier environments largely just by its ability to deploy changes out to orgs. So we don't have a whole bunch of inbuilt UI to back propagate changes. We do tend to encourage you to kind of push you towards leaning on your source control provider a little bit for that, because I think back propagating changes is probably 50% about merging branches and then 50% about deploying those changes back out to upstream environments. So we kind of let you lean on your source control provider to handle that merging side of things, but then obviously Gearset with its CI jobs and things like that can automatically push those changes back out to upstream environments. And also you can run manual comparisons and deployments where you can do things like look at the differences between the changes you're back propagating and your own environment and make sure that you're not overwriting any of the changes that you've made in that environment when you run that deployment. Another question here, in terms of DevOps in general, what would be the biggest distinction for ISVs publishing managed packages? I'm not sure it's feasible without more sophisticated branches. So I think actually if I've understood the question properly, I think the main reason that we see ISVs publish managed packages more regularly is it's almost a more natural fit in terms of model for how they've been working before, given that they've been using the packaging system all along. That's a good question about actually the sophistication of the branching models. So It's one that I'd also not really thought about. Yeah, I think it doesn't necessarily have to, it doesn't require using a more complex branching model like Git flow. So I think the point when it comes to managed packages is the point that the choice that introduces the complexity is about when you push those changes out to various users. So I think you can still follow a really feature branch based model throughout development, constantly releasing your changes through to your kind of internal packaging environment. But then it's just a choice of when you push those changes out to end users. So you kind of end up introducing a two-step kind of production process where you have kind of your internal staging environment, which you're essentially continuously deploying to, and you could do that using a feature branch model. And then you have the slightly larger push, which I guess should be balanced on how complex the changes you're making are based on things like semantic versioning, and how, I guess, your relationship with your users and how likely they are to be amenable to having those changes rolled out more regularly. So for instance, at Gearset, we use the feature branching model and we deploy Gearset, I think, around 2.5 times a day on average. And that's because I guess the way we work internally facilitates that, and the way we've managed to start slicing up features is, again, pretty amenable to that kind of process. And then we've got a user base that's quite happy to see really regular releases and new functionality being released to them, rather than having to go through a big bang upgrade process once every quarter or so. Do I think DevOps Center will require additions to IP address whitelisting, or will it be accessible through the same IPs as the rest of Salesforce? I don't have an answer to that question, I'm afraid. My guess is, I actually don't know. I wouldn't even want to guess. Sorry, I'm really not sure. Does Gearset support Velocity and Encino from Ravi? Good question, Ravi. I'll start with Encino because that's probably a slightly easier one to answer. So the short answer is yes. The long answer is honestly not as well as I think we should, but you can deploy Encino config changes with Gearset. It just takes a little bit of experience running those types of deployments. I guess moving on to Velocity, and then I'll circle back around to Encino. Moving on to Velocity at the moment, no, not really. Velocity deployments are a bit more of a complex beast. That said, we have just shipped to production, I think a couple of days ago, first slice of Velocity support in Gearset. So you can now run comparisons between Velocity configs between two orgs. We probably kicked off this work maybe about 3 or 4 weeks ago or so. So we're moving real quick on it. And the next slice will be running Velocity deployments between two orgs. And then obviously these are all forward-looking statements, so please don't make purchasing decisions based on them. But this is literally what's in development at the moment. So yeah, we'll have a slice to deploy Velocity changes probably early next year, I would say, or late this year. And then we've got a bunch more development around that that's going on. And once we finish with that Velocity case, we're going to start building a bit more finesse around things like Encino deployments and CPQ deployments, things that you can do in Gearset today, but we strongly believe we could do significantly better than you can find anywhere else. So that's a little bit of a sneak preview into our more forward-looking roadmap there. But please don't make purchasing decisions based on it. I'm at the end of the questions that I've got here, but I can stick around for another few minutes if anybody has anything else they'd like to ask. And thank you so much for all the questions so far. Really appreciate them. I'd be really curious to, if anyone wants to post as a question, any thoughts they have around DevOps Center, whether they're excited about it, whether they plan to use it, whether they plan to use DX alongside it. I'd be super curious to hear. Thanks for the kind words, Larry. Appreciate it. Ravi, you are coming through with plenty of product questions today, which I like. Does Gearset offer any Salesforce backup and recovery solution? Yes, it does. So I guess one of the things that we'd kind of planned fairly early on was to make Gearset first solve the metadata problem of transforming and deploying metadata, so you can essentially update schemas pretty trivially. Then try and solve the data problem where we deploy hierarchies, essentially fairly complex hierarchies of data with relationships and dependencies. And then once you solve both of those, it makes the backup problem a bit more addressable. So we started out going down those routes, and then we approached backup. So yeah, we've had a backup product available for probably about the last year now. So feel free to go check that out. And obviously there's a free demo of that too. So with all of the things that I talk about with Gearset, you can just go straight to the website, click try it now, and then you're up and running in a couple of seconds without having to give us any card details or talk to anyone or anything like that. So feel free to go ahead and try it, and please send your feedback over. I've got another question around pricing of DevOps Center. So I think the only announcement that's been made so far, unless something's changed since I last checked, which was probably about a month ago, the plan is that there will be a paid tier. I can't remember if there's going to be a free tier or not, but there'll definitely be some aspect of this that's paid. I can actually, if you want to drop me an email again, I can send you a link to where I found that, because I remember where that information is posted. And I've got a feeling that Salesforce keep it up to date. And then Bill said he's very close to getting Gearset connected, and he's going to stick to it and not worry too much about DevOps Center. Well, that's nice. That's what I would like to hear. Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that, or at least one of the things that makes me feel pretty comfortable. Comfortable is probably the wrong word, but I guess happy to be working alongside the stuff that's going on inside Salesforce, is that the changes that they're making are really beneficial for the existing tools vendors as well. So the things that are happening in DevOps Center are kind of improving some of the underlying infrastructure and APIs that we can rely on. So I mentioned source tracking, for instance. Source tracking is potentially like a really significant improvement, especially for tools like Gearset, where we rely quite heavily on comparisons, because we spend a decent amount of time slurping metadata out of Salesforce orgs. And if you can reduce that to just what's changed, then that's a huge benefit. So all of these changes that happen inside DevOps Center, they just improve every other tool as well. So we just see this as another team to work with. And then I guess the other thing I'd say is that I think we have a team of about 35 software engineers now, which is quite a big team. And honestly, it's the best technical team I've ever worked with. So we've got people who have worked at Microsoft and the games industry and all kinds of different places with all kinds of different great skills, which means that we're in a really good place to immediately take advantage of these things that Salesforce are shipping that we can use, which just frees us up to make other aspects of Gearset even better. So, and Kenny says, let me just read through. Yeah, that makes lots of sense. Excited about DevOps Center because that common problem of getting declarative admins involved in that release pipeline. Yes, and again, I've definitely heard of lots of folks struggling to take advantage of Scratch orgs, and absolutely one of the problems is around things like dependencies on managed packages. We've definitely seen those as a bit of a stumbling block as well. And yeah, I imagine that individual sandbox development is going to be a really popular thing for a long time as well. I don't think that'll ever go away. And I remember when Scratch orgs first got announced, people were asking questions like, does this mean that there's not going to be any sandbox development anymore? And back then we thought that it would be quite unlikely that you'd see sandbox development disappear. And I still think that's true today. I think, again, the place that we see Scratch orgs used most commonly is for is in ISVs, where generally, basically anywhere that packaging is used really heavily, there's normally quite good alignment with Scratch orgs, and that's usually either ISVs or kind of new greenfield build outs for organizations that are new to Salesforce and generally have fairly technical teams as well. But in those more established cases, then it's much less common for us to see reliance on Scratch orgs and packaging. Any more thoughts or questions, folks, or should I leave you to the rest of your days? I'll give it a couple more minutes until 10:02. But thanks so much for all these thoughts. It's really, I wish I could switch on cameras for everyone and just turn this into a conversation. That might make it a bit more fun and less one-sided. But I do appreciate all your thoughts and questions coming in. Thanks, Bill. Bill said he appreciates that we're so accessible as a team. And that's one of the things that we pride ourselves on too. So if you do ever want to talk about any of this stuff, I had a couple people reach out last time we did a webinar like this via email, and jumped on calls with them just to talk through DevOps on Salesforce. I'm absolutely happy to have conversations about any of this stuff with you without any sales pitch. I am not a salesperson, as I'm sure you can tell. I'm a software engineer and a nerd. So you can ask any questions that you want without any worry of that. Is Gearset SOC 3 compliant? That's a good question, Ravi. I guess in the true sense of the word, no, we're not SOC 3 compliant, but we do use a bunch of infrastructure that is SOC 3 compliant. So we use, obviously we're entirely built on AWS, and all of those data centers that we rely on have all kinds of compliance certificates. What we do have is ISO 27001 and some very well documented processes. And we found that that's very often sufficient for the majority of people that we speak to. But obviously we're constantly looking at further forms of compliance that might make it a little bit easier to pick up Gearset and start using it. And thanks, Bill. Oh, that's great to hear. Bill's called out one of our colleagues, Dan, from the customer success team, who did a nice presentation to the technical folks at his place, which helped them get up and running using Gearset and Bitbucket, and that's really nice to hear. I think one of the things, I don't want this to turn into propaganda at this point, but one of the things that we do well at Gearset is we try to make the whole team really accessible, and we try to be very very responsive to customer support requests and help with onboarding and just help getting the most out of the tool throughout using it. Because I think where we've seen what we enjoy doing the most is taking users that are new to a lot of these DevOps concepts and helping them grow their reliance and use of DevOps over time. It is usually a journey. Like, we do speak to lots of users who, maybe aren't using source control or aren't using it very heavily. Maybe they're just using it as a backup to begin with, and they're just pulling changes out of their org on a periodic basis and dumping them in Git, so they know they've got a decent audit history or something that they could roll back to if they absolutely needed to. But then taking them all the way through to having that kind of full end-to-end CI pipeline with deployments out to various intermediary environments and so on. I think that's what we get the biggest kick out of, is helping people go on that journey, helping them figure out where they are and what the next steps are to kind of get them further along there. I'm glad to hear that Dan could help with that, Bill. Okay, folks, well, that takes us to 10:02, so I will leave you all to it now, but thank you so much. And one last time, if you do ever want to talk about any of this stuff with me personally or anyone else on the team, feel free to reach out via the website or just email me at matt@gearset.com, and I'm more than happy to talk. Thanks again, and speak soon.